ask this question. If a member of Parliament sees certain to him real, growing and threatening dangers, is he to be silent? Is he to say nothing about it? Is he to suppress the fact? This thing, on present trends, unless something is done, numerically, is in its infancy.
There you are, you see. There's the BBC, there's the television. There's television. That's what television is for in this country. Television in this country is used to cast the mantle over disorder.
He was a grammar school boy from the Midlands. He would become an intellectual giant of post-war British politics. At one point, he was the youngest professor in the Empire. Later, he was one of the youngest brigadiers in the army. Together, perhaps, with Clement Attlee, Roy Jenkins and Margaret Thatcher, Enoch Powell was one of those rare politicians whose ideas shaped not only their own era, but those that follow. And of all the ideas that Powell championed, it was his dedication to the nation-state, its history, its glory, and its fragility that defined his career and which has a pressing relevance to our own times. He saw threats all around, but two in particular, Europe and high levels of immigration. Powell is a figure of rare complexity and controversy who has been reduced by some to the level of caricature. This is mainly because, for all the words and ideas he left behind, it was one speech which defined how we view him now.
I think there are many people who have no idea about this speech, and I think it was very good that they don't. What I fear is that there are certain elements who are taking from it, and it's informing their dialogue.
This speech, actually, for all the criticism that it has and all the controversy that it will no doubt stir up for the next 50 years, was a speech that made him as a great national statesman.
I consider that this speech should be buried. It shouldn't fade into history, it should just be buried. Who was this man?
Where I think he is culpable is giving respectability to the most ugly, racist, fascist organisation and activity that results in people being attacked on the streets.
The very notion of making a programme about his Rivers of Blood speech is to risk drawing ire from all sides. And whilst I'm not here to bury Powell nor to praise him, I don't think that his most famous speech, all 3,183 words of it, should be treated with kid gloves. Thinking, talking about Rivers of Blood can only be done meaningfully if we consider the original text in its entirety, however uncomfortable that experience might be. It is part of post-war British history, and to understand the full fire of the debate which is still with us today, we have to hear the words that sparked it.
In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time...
Only a few brief extracts were recorded on film by a bank holiday news crew from ATV in Birmingham.
How dare I say such a horrible thing?
Although they'd seen a copy of the script, they arguably missed some of the most inflammatory bits, most of the context, and, crucially, its defining crescendo. We've asked the actor Ian McDermott to recreate Powell's words for us tonight. We'll be butting in from time to time as the speech unfolds, to hear what voices from modern Britain make of it. It's 2:30 in the afternoon of Saturday, April the 20th, 1968. Enoch Powell has just arrived in the lobby of the Midland Hotel in Birmingham to address the annual general meeting of the West Midlands Area Conservative Political Centre. Now, the media over the last few days has been full of reports of race riots in America, and just 2 weeks ago, Martin Luther King has been assassinated. Here in Britain, the Labour government's Race Relations Bill is going through Parliament, and with it comes the possibility that Britain might allow a new wave of migrants from Commonwealth nations. Crucially, the Tory party, in opposition, is split on this issue. Its leader, Edward Heath, is no ally of his Shadow Defence Secretary. Unusually, Powell hasn't obeyed the custom of sending the leader's office advance notice of the speech he's going to give today. Mr. Powell is getting to his feet. He's wearing a dark three-piece suit, tightly knotted tie, pocket square. He's been quoted as telling at least one close friend that this speech is, and I quote, going to go up, fizz like a rocket, and stay up.
The supreme function of statesmanship is to provide against preventable evils. In seeking to do so, it encounters obstacles which are deeply rooted in human nature. One is that by the very order of things, such evils are not demonstrable until they have occurred. At each stage in their onset, there is room for doubt and for dispute, whether they be real or imaginary. By the same token, they attract little attention in comparison with current troubles, which are both indisputable and pressing, whence the besetting temptation of all politics to concern itself with the immediate present at the expense of the future. Above all, people are disposed to mistake predicting troubles for causing troubles, and even for desiring troubles. If only, they love to think, if only people wouldn't talk about it, it probably wouldn't happen. Perhaps this habit goes back to the primitive belief that the word and the thing, the name and the object, are identical. At all events, the discussion of future grave but with effort, now avoidable evils, is the most unpopular and at the same time the most necessary occupation for the politician. Those who knowingly shirk it deserve and not infrequently receive the curses of those who come after. A week or two ago, I fell into conversation with a constituent, a middle-aged, quite ordinary working man employed in one of our nationalized industries. After a sentence or two about the weather, he suddenly said, "If I had the money to go, I wouldn't stay in this country." I made some deprecatory reply to the effect that even this government wouldn't last forever, but he took no notice and continued, "I have 3 children, all of them been through grammar school and 2 of them married now with family. I shan't be satisfied till I have seen them all settled overseas. In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man." I can already hear the chorus of execration. How dare I say such a horrible thing? How dare I stir up trouble and inflame feelings by repeating such a conversation? The answer is that I do not have the right not to do so. Here is a decent, ordinary fellow Englishman who in broad daylight in my own town says to me, his Member of Parliament, that this country will not be worth living in for his children. I simply do not have the right to shrug my shoulders and think about something else. What he is saying, thousands and hundreds of thousands are saying and thinking, not throughout Great Britain perhaps, but in the areas that are already undergoing the total transformation to which there is no parallel in 1,000 years of English history. In 15 or 20 years, on present trends, there will be in this country 3.5 million Commonwealth immigrants and their descendants. That is not my figure. That is the official figure given to Parliament by the spokesman of the Registrar General's office. There is no comparable official figure for the year 2000, but it must be in the region of 5 to 7 million, approximately 1/10 of the whole population, and approaching that of Greater London. Of course, it will not be evenly distributed from Margate to Aberystwyth, and from Penzance to Aberdeen. Whole areas, towns and parts of towns across England will be occupied largely and wholly by different sections of the immigrant and immigrant-descended population. As time goes on, the proportion of this total who are immigrant descendants, those born in England, those who arrived here by exactly the same route as the rest of us, will rapidly increase. Already, By 1985, the native-born will constitute the majority. It is this fact, above all, which creates the extreme urgency of action now, of just that kind of action which is hardest for politicians to take. Action where the difficulties lie in the present, but the evils to be prevented or minimized lie several parliaments ahead.
The Right Honourable Enoch Powell MP, speaking to the annual general meeting of the West Midlands Area Conservative Political Centre in Birmingham. I, like many, hear these opening remarks and take a sharp intake of breath. Powell's intent is being laid out. This is a speech that is to be both politically and emotionally charged. But first, consider the rhetoric, the devices he's using. In that opening passage, Powell evokes two characters. One is the common man of England, who is in danger of being forgotten, but finds personification in the constituent that he happened upon. The other character we meet is, of course, Powell himself, not just our narrator, but a key figure in the plot to unfold. He presents himself as an honour-bound prophet, recommending practical and urgent action. The motif is that of a far-sighted but reluctant tribune. This sense of urgency is given greater moral force by a paradox of politics which, Powell says, he is willing to accept. Preventing future horror means combating taboos, and this is both uniquely unpopular and uniquely necessary.
I came to Britain in the 60s and grew up in the shadow of Enoch Powell, terrorized by him. He shaped my childhood through his rhetoric. Really, I think of myself as a child of Powell.
David Daberdeen is Professor of Literary Studies at the University of Warwick.
He talks about evil. That evil actually is talking about my father, who had a name. His name was David. He's talking about my aunt, the bus conductress, whose name was Sugi, Aunt Sugi. These were not evil people. I mean, I can't... They may have been mischievous and bad in their own ways. Suddenly, we immigrants, coming with our broomsticks and our dusters, are part of an extraordinarily transformative process. We didn't know any of this.
So he sets himself up as, I am the statesman, I am going to tell you about this. Nobody else will.
Pauline Black is the lead singer of the two-tone band The Selector.
The reason why he is making this speech is indisputable and pressing. I mean, he doesn't give you time for argument.
I was shocked at just how intemperate the speech is.
Broadcaster and former Conservative MP Matthew Parris.
There aren't just a couple of slightly dodgy remarks. It's laced through with evident racism, with implicit racism, with trying to use the racism of others whom he's reporting to disguise, but not entirely to conceal his own racism.
He saw his job as a Member of Parliament to articulate the feelings of his constituents.
Simon Heffer is a historian, journalist, and Enoch Powell's official biographer.
He talks about this offensive comment by a man who comes up to him and says in 20 years' time the black man will have the whip hand over the white man in this country. Enoch says, I can already hear the chorus of execration, how dare I say such a thing. But he then says, well, by what right do I remain silent? When one of my constituents comes up to me in the street, I don't have the right to just say, oh, go away and stop worrying about it. As he says in the opening line of the speech, the supreme function of statesmanship is to provide against preventable evils. And he saw the immigration policy as a preventable evil.
Reading the speech again, I am very struck by what I remembered at the time was all this complicated classical language.
Lord Hayne was an anti-apartheid and anti-racist activist at the time.
And it was this intellectual respectability, this cloak of legitimacy, given to racist and fascist sentiments, which disturbs me now, as it disturbed me shockingly at the time.
Enoch Powell was a kind of bogeyman in the house I grew up in. He was a bit like the sort of wallpaper. He was all around as a cautionary tale of what parts of the establishment felt about black people.
David Lammy is the MP for Tottenham in North London.
That assertion that in 15 or 20 years' time the black man will have the whip hand over the white man makes one think of the Deep South, because what it's really about when you say whip is brutality, is oppression,
is a sort of slavery reversed. We're back in the room at the Midlands Hotel in Birmingham. The Right Honourable Enoch Powell MP is about 6 minutes into his speech, and he turns his attention to the practical policies of dealing with immigration.
The natural and rational first question with a nation confronted by such a prospect is to ask, how can its dimensions be reduced? Granted it be not wholly preventable, can it be limited, bearing in mind that numbers are of the essence? The significance and consequences of an alien element introduced into a country or population are profoundly different according to whether that element is 1% or 10%. The answers to the simple and rational question are equally simple and rational. By stopping or virtually stopping further inflow and by promoting the maximum outflow. Both answers are part of the official policy of the Conservative Party. It almost passes belief that at this moment 20 or 30 additional immigrant children are arriving from overseas in Wolverhampton alone every week. And that means 15 or 20 additional families of a decade or two hence. Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. We must be mad. Literally mad as a nation to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents who are for the most part the material of the future growth of the immigrant-descended population. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre. So insane are we that we actually permit unmarried persons to immigrate for the purpose of founding a family with spouses and fiancés whom they have never seen. Let no one suppose that this flow of dependence is about to tail off automatically. On the contrary, even at the present admission rate of only 5,000 a year by voucher, there is sufficient for a further 25,000 dependents per annum ad infinitum, without taking into account the huge reservoir of existing relations in this country. And I am making no allowance at all for fraudulent entry. In these circumstances, nothing will suffice but that the total inflow for settlement should be reduced at once to negligible proportions, and that the necessary legislative and administrative measures be taken without delay. I stress the words for settlement. This has nothing to do with the entry of Commonwealth citizens any more than of aliens into this country for the purposes of study or of improving their qualifications, like, for instance, the Commonwealth doctors, who to the advantage of their own countries have enabled our hospital service to be expanded faster than would otherwise have been possible. They are not, and never have been, immigrants. I turn to re-emigration. If all immigration ended tomorrow, the rate of growth of the immigrant and the immigrant-descended population would be substantially reduced. But the prospective size of this element in the population would still leave the basic character of the national danger unaffected. This can only be tackled while a considerable proportion of the total still comprises persons who entered this country during the last 10 years or so. Hence the urgency of implementing now the second element of the Conservative Party's policy, the encouragement of re-emigration. Nobody can make an estimate of the numbers which, with generous grants and assistance, would choose either to return to their countries of origin or to go to other countries anxious to receive the manpower and the skills they represent. Nobody knows, because no such policy has yet been attempted. I can only say that, even at present, immigrants in my own constituency from time to time come to me asking if I can find them assistance to return home. If such a policy were adopted and pursued with the determination which the gravity of the alternative justifies, the resultant outflow could appreciably alter the prospects for the future. It can be no part of any policy that existing families should be kept divided, but there are two directions in which families can be reunited, and if our former and present immigration laws have brought about the division of families, albeit voluntarily or semi-voluntarily, we ought to be prepared to arrange for them to be reunited in their countries of origin. In short, suspension of immigration and encouragement of re-emigration hang together logically and humanely as two aspects of the same approach.
This section of the speech, in which the word policy appears 5 times, combines a clear plan of action and dry numerical analysis with metaphors that have resounded through history. Britain is a nation going mad, literally mad, and this madness leads to suicide. The power of the imagery here, with insanity, death and celestial punishment, almost overwhelms the policy recommendations. What lingers in the mind isn't a new target for net inward migration, it's that funeral pyre, our funeral pyre. Eleanor Smith is the current MP for Powell's old seat of Wolverhampton South West.
The burning of pyres, the burning of the streets. He's not saying it's going to happen today, but he sees that generations, which would be, I suppose, my generation in particular, because I would have been the firstborn, are going to be the ones that are going to do this. And so it's no hope.
Powell refers to Sophocles, to the play Antigone.
David Daberdeen.
That play is about the inevitability of disaster as a result of flaws in society and in characters. So he's outlining some grand tragedy of classical proportions that will befall Britain.
He talks about re-immigration. I mean, obviously the more familiar word is repatriation.
David Goodhart from the think tank The Policy Exchange.
It was, at the time, some voluntary repatriation, obviously, was Conservative Party policy. So Powell's claim that he was not departing from policy was to some extent justified.
Everywhere you looked around on railway bridges, there were signs of Keep Britain White.
Former chair of the Commission for Racial Equality, Lord Ouseley.
Powell was very clever of not expressing himself in such terms, so he couldn't be accused of aligning himself to such right-wing extreme views. But it added up to the same thing. It sent out the same shockwaves. It aroused the anger, and it certainly put the fear of God into the hearts of many black people, particularly those who were fragile themselves. They were really being told, you're not wanted, go home.
This idea of kind of sending people back because that's enough now is a sentiment that really still hasn't gone.
Guz Khan is a former teacher from Coventry. He's now a stand-up comedian.
If you look at the right wing and their messages for minorities in this country now, it's still, hold a minute, I understand you might have been able to send my old dear home. She knew somebody there. Mate, I've been back to Pakistan once. Born and raised, bruv, do you know what I mean?
I think the bottom line is there is no sense of the obligation.
David Lammy.
Why that empire was there. Why those relationships were there. Why these people were here. What they had been asked to come. The sense of duty and service and obligation that they gave to this country, rebuilding the NHS, rebuilding our transport system. Nothing of that. And everything of the kind of fear and the bogeyman that these people should be set up to be.
We're 13 minutes into the Rivers of Blood speech. Enoch Powell is still on his feet at the Midland Hotel in Birmingham. His theme has moved on to the status of the immigrant.
The third element of the Conservative Party's policy is that all who are in this country as citizens shall be equal before the law, and that there shall be no discrimination or difference made between them by public authority. As Mr. Heath has put it, we will have no first-class citizens and second-class citizens. This does not mean that the immigrant and his descendants should be elevated into a privileged or special class, or that any citizen should be denied his right to discriminate in the management of his own affairs between one fellow citizen and another, or that he should be subjected to inquisition as to his reasons and motives for behaving in one lawful manner rather than another. There can be no grosser misconception of the realities than is entertained by those who vociferously demand legislation, as they call it, against discrimination, whether they be leader writers of the same kidney and sometimes on the same newspapers as those which year after year in the 1930s tried to blind this country to the rising peril which confronted it, or archbishops who live in palaces, faring delicately with the bedclothes pulled right up over their heads. They have got it exactly and diametrically wrong. The discrimination and the deprivation, a sense of alarm and of resentment, lie not with the immigrant population, but with those among whom they have come and are still coming. This is why to enact legislation of the kind before Parliament at this moment is to risk throwing a match onto gunpowder. The kindest thing that can be said about those who propose and support it is that they know not what they do. Nothing is more misleading than to compare the Commonwealth immigrant in Britain with the American Negro. The Negro population of the United States, which was already in existence before the United States became a nation, started literally as slaves and were later given the franchise and other rights of citizenship, to the exercise of which they have only gradually and still incompletely come. The Commonwealth immigrant came to Britain as a full citizen, to a country which knew no discrimination between one citizen and another, and he entered instantly into the possession of the full rights of every citizen, from the vote to free treatment under the National Health Service. Whatever drawbacks attended the immigrants, and there were drawbacks which did not and do not make admission into Britain by hook or crook appear less than desirable, arose not from the law, or from public policy, or from administration, but from those personal circumstances and accidents which cause and always will cause the fortunes and experience of one man to be different from another's. But while to the immigrant, entry to this country was admission to privileges and opportunities eagerly sought, the impact upon the existing population was very different. For reasons which they could not comprehend, and in pursuance of a decision by default on which they were never consulted, they found themselves made strangers in their own country. They found their wives unable to obtain hospital beds in childbirth, their children unable to obtain school places, their homes and neighbourhoods changed beyond recognition, their plans and prospects for the future defeated. At work, they found that employers hesitated to apply to the immigrant worker the standards of discipline and competence required of the native-born worker. They began to hear, as time went by, more and more voices which told them they were now the unwanted. On top of this, they now learn that a one-way privilege is to be established by Act of Parliament. A law which cannot and is not intended to operate to protect them or redress their grievances is to be enacted to give the stranger, the disgruntled, and the agent provocateur the power to pillory them for their private actions.
Populism is the habit of pitting the people, who are assumed to have a single will, against the elites, and creating a narrative in which the latter have betrayed the former. In his brutal takedown of both archbishops, portrayed as palace-dwelling cowards, and what today we call the mainstream media, this part of Powell's speech could be straight from the populist handbook. The heavy foreboding of Powell's intonation when he says these immigrants are still coming, and in the spectre of race riots similar to those raging in America, raises the haunting prospect of a bleak and British apocalypse ahead. Who could miss the parallels with the arguments of some of those campaigners who pushed for Brexit, or with Donald Trump in America? Enoch Powell gave them their most familiar tunes. He mentions pressure on public services, and neighbourhoods change so much that the common people become strangers in their own country.
Powell was not making a racist speech. He was not talking about race.
Simon Heffer.
He was talking about numbers. What we've learned since 2004 is that you can have white Christian people coming into this country in large numbers who look like us and who have a culture very similar to ours in many respects. But because of the sheer weight of numbers, they put such pressure on our housing, on our services, that we as a nation cannot cope. And it causes tensions among people who say, well, I've lived here all my life, I pay taxes all my life.
Because he's scaremongering about hospital beds, about no one to deliver your baby.
Transparency and Remain campaigner Gina Miller.
Exactly the same phrases and fear was built up in the referendum. You know, this speech is resounding and echoing again 50 years later, and that's very disturbing because we are a much more integrated society.
Around this time, there's massive race riots in America.
Wolverhampton-born journalist and writer Satnam Sanghera.
And I think Enoch had just been to America, and he saw America as a failed state, really, or as a failed idea. And he came back determined to stop similar thing happening in the UK.
Pauline Black.
Enoch Powell was directly equating, i.e. the troubles that were happening there, with prospective troubles that could possibly happen in this country if black people were given rights.
He was representing a view that said that it ought to be legitimate to act in favour of your own ethnic group.
David Goodhart.
We find that unacceptable, I think rightly so, from the majority, but the argument hasn't completely gone away in that I think there is a sense today of what one might call a certain kind of asymmetrical multiculturalism, that while it's right that the people from the white ethnic majority are not allowed to discriminate in favour of people like them, that somehow the boundary maintenance, the cultural protection that you see in all sorts of different ways in minority populations is allowed.
We're talking about and listening to Enoch Powell's 1968 Rivers of Blood speech, a speech that's been quoted, misquoted, and to a large degree mythologized over the last 50 years. Powell was right is a banner that has been unfurled on many occasions, chiefly by the far right. And in some quarters, the debate over whether Powell was a racist is still being discussed. All of which demands that we go back to the full text and examine what he actually said. At the Midland Hotel, Mr. Powell is about to draw on the experiences of some of his constituents.
In the hundreds upon hundreds of letters I received when I last spoke on this subject 2 or 3 months ago, there was one striking feature which was largely new and which I find ominous. All members of Parliament are used to the typical anonymous correspondent, but what surprised and alarmed me was the high proportion of ordinary, decent, sensible people writing a rational and often well-educated letter who believed that they had to omit their address because it was dangerous to have committed themselves to paper to a member of Parliament agreeing with the views I had expressed, and they would risk either penalties or reprisals if they were known to have done so. A sense of being a persecuted minority which is growing among ordinary English people in the areas of the country which are affected is something that those without direct experience can hardly imagine. I'm going to allow just one of those hundreds of people to speak for me. She did give her name and address, which I have detached from the letter which I am about to read. She was writing from Northumberland about something which is happening at this moment in my own constituency. 8 years ago, in a respectable street in Wolverhampton, a house was sold to a Negro. Now only one white. A woman, old age pensioner, lives there. This is her story. She lost her husband and both her sons in the war. So she turned her 7-roomed house, her only asset, into a boarding house. She worked hard and did well, paid off her mortgage, and began to put something by for her old age. Then the immigrants moved in. With growing fear, she saw one house after another taken over. The quiet street became a place of noise and confusion. Regretfully, her white tenants moved out. The day after the last one left, she was awakened at 7 a.m. by 2 Negroes who wanted to use her phone to contact their employer. When she refused, as she would have refused any stranger at such an hour, she was abused and feared she would have been attacked but for the chain on her door. Immigrant families have tried to rent rooms in her house, but she always refused. Her little store of money went, and after paying her rates, she has less than £2 per week. She went to apply for a rate reduction, and was seen by a young girl who, on hearing she had a 7-roomed house, suggested she should let part of it. When she said the only people she could get were Negroes, the girl said, "Racial prejudice won't get you anywhere in this country." So she went home. The telephone is her lifeline. Her family pay the bill and help her out as best they can. Immigrants have offered to buy her house at a price which the prospective landlord would be able to recover from his tenants in weeks, or at most a few months. She is becoming afraid to go out. Windows are broken. She finds excreta pushed through her letterbox. When she goes to the shops, she is followed by children, charming, wide, grinning pickaninnies. They cannot speak English, but one word they know. Racialist, they chant. When the new race relations bill is passed, this woman is convinced she will go to prison. And is she so wrong? I begin to wonder.
Like all great orators, Powell grasped at a deep level that we understand things in terms of emotional narratives. It's a cornerstone of journalism. People relate to people. And who could be more relatable, more vulnerable and sympathetic than the old widow who had lost her husband and both sons in the war? Powell explicitly said this is her story. Except the old lady may not have existed. In an interview with David Frost 9 months later, Powell admitted he never actually met this individual. Simon Heffer.
This woman is articulating on her mother's behalf a person who has been left behind by a tide of change. The key point for Powell, who was a Democrat to his fingertips, is that nobody ever asked this woman or people like her whether they minded this great cultural and societal change going on around them.
Eleanor Smith.
When she goes to the shop, she's followed by children, charming, wide, grinning pickaninnies. I mean, that for me, he has said that, and that's what he's thinking. So if you look on the whole of the picture, look at the whole of what he's given you, you come to think that actually it's about his perception, He's using a third party, but he's only using her to bring out what he is thinking and what he is about.
Guz Khan.
Enoch says that a respectable street in Wolverhampton, that's a key word, a respectable street in Wolverhampton, one house was sold to a Negro. Just the one cheeky house was sold to a Negro. And now every single one of those houses is owned by Negroes and South Asians. This once white majority area has been torn apart for good and is now disreputable. Look at these immigrants that have come here and changed the scope of this street for good. And I think what he's throwing towards there, what he's alluding to, is that that's just one street in Wolverhampton. It will be your street next.
An absolutely striking and central feature of populism and of populist rhetoric is the attempt to represent oneself as an underdog.
Matthew Paris.
Notice when populists speak, they start by placing themselves in the position of the underdog, of the bullied, when the underlying context of what they want to say is that they want to bully. And so in this case, Enoch Powell is suggesting that people who want to express their worries about immigration are afraid to put their names to the letters.
You were dealing with dynamite. Don't you think much more, for instance, in that first story about the woman who had excrement pushed through her letterbox and so on, that you had a duty to do more than merely put quotation marks around it? Didn't you have a fantastic duty to check that story to find if it was true?
I haven't the slightest doubt it was. But may I...
Did you check it at all?
I haven't the slightest doubt.
Did you check it at all?
I haven't the slightest doubt, and I verified the source from which I had that information.
Did you verify the story?
I verified the source, and I haven't the slightest doubt
but what do you mean you verified the source?
That it is as true as it is typical.
But it's not typical. I mean, I'm not saying it hasn't happened. I'm not saying... you say it's typical.
Yes, I do.
See, you keep using words like typical,
yes.
So there's millions of piles of excrement dropping through letterboxes
yes.
up and down our green and pleasant land, to use your own phrase, and that's not happening. And if you're quoting a specific case and you're verifying... It's not millions?
Well,
typical?
Not millions.
Typical?
Typical of what happens in areas where the immigrant population is increasing in numbers and is taking over...
Not typical. Not typical.
When I was writing Powell's biography, his widow and I almost literally tore their house apart looking for this letter. I said to his widow at the time, this is going to cause me problems because many people think this letter never existed. And she, who was just as honest as he was, in other words, completely transparently honest, became very agitated and said, I saw that letter dozens of times. He walked around with it in his wallet for years, just in case anybody came up to him and dared him to produce the letter, he could produce it. I have no doubt it existed. I just wish I could find it. I hope one day it turns up.
We're into the final section of Enoch Powell's speech, 6 minutes to go. And just for the record, no one has walked out in disgust or shown much disapproval. His final theme is integration.
The other dangerous delusion from which those who are willfully or otherwise blind to realities suffer is summed up in the word integration. To be integrated into a population means to become, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from its other members. Now, at all times where there are marked physical differences, especially of colour, integration is difficult, though, over a period, not impossible. There are among the Commonwealth immigrants who have come to live here in the last 15 years or so many thousands whose wish and purpose is to be integrated and whose every thought and endeavour is bent in that direction. But to imagine that such a thing enters the heads of a great and growing majority of immigrants and their descendants is a ludicrous misconception and a dangerous one to boot. We are on the verge here of a change. Hitherto, it has been force of circumstance and of background which has rendered the very idea of integration inaccessible to the greater part of the immigrant population, that they never conceived or intended such a thing, and that their numbers and physical concentration meant that pressures towards integration, which normally bear upon any small minority, did not operate. Now we are seeing the growth of positive forces acting against integration, of vested interests in the preservation and sharpening of racial and religious differences with a view to the exercise of actual domination, first over fellow immigrants and then over the rest of the population. The cloud, no bigger than a man's hand, that can so rapidly overcast the sky, has been visible recently in Wolverhampton and has shown signs of spreading quickly. The words I'm about to use verbatim, as they appeared in the local press on the 17th of February, are not mine, but those of a Labour Member of Parliament who is a minister in the present government. The Sikh community's campaign to maintain customs inappropriate in Britain is much to be regretted. Working in Britain, particularly in the public services, they should be prepared to accept the terms and conditions of their employment. To claim special communal rights, or should one say rights, leads to a dangerous fragmentation within society. This communalism is a canker. Whether practiced by one colour or another, it is to be strongly condemned. All credit to John Stonehouse for having had the insight to perceive that, and the courage to say it. For these dangerous and divisive elements, the legislation proposed in the Race Relations Bill is the very pabulum they need to flourish on. Here is their means of showing that the immigrant communities can organize to consolidate their members, to agitate and campaign against their fellow citizens, and to overawe and dominate the rest with legal weapons which the ignorant and the ill-informed have provided. As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood. That tragic and intractable phenomenon which we watch with horror on the other side of the Atlantic, but which there is interwoven with the history and existence of the States itself, is coming upon us here by our own volition and our own neglect. Indeed, it has all but come. In numerical terms, it will be of American proportions long before the end of the century. Only resolute and urgent action will avert it even now. Whether there will be the public will to demand and obtain that action, I do not know. All I know is to see and not to speak would be the great betrayal.
Powell knew that to win an argument, you must not only persuade the audience of your own position, but demolish the other side. In this case, the other side are the proponents of integration, an allegedly weasel word representing the hollow aims of those who do not understand the workings of a nation. In that notorious final paragraph, which so defined his legacy, the invocation of Virgil drew all the headlines. But think back to that last line and its rhetorical force. The most celebrated political speeches of the 20th century have always leant heavily on short, monosyllabic words that penetrate the consciousness of the public. Think of "I have a dream," or "We shall fight them on the beaches," or "Ask not what your country can do for you." Powell borrows this tool. All I know is that to see and not to speak would be the great betrayal. That gives Powell's payoff its crescendo, adding to the moral strength of his final thought and raising it, in the minds of those he persuaded, to the level of sacrament.
Here he was wrapping this up by saying, everything I've told you leads us to this Armageddon. And this was the crunch moment, the crescendo of his speech. Is what filled people with fear.
It is apocalyptic, and the line, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood, was, I think, guaranteed to cause ructions, and he knew it.
Obviously he's quoting Virgil, he's quoting the Aeneid, he's quoting the possibility of the destruction of Rome, etc., etc. So he's again placing the immigrant situation in the context of disaster. But it's referring also immediately to the civil rights movement in America, where he's saying, my God, look at them marching. All of this trouble will come to us. Now, what were the black people in America marching for? The right to vote, the right to sit in a bus like any other citizen. Civil rights.
We have had riots, which are probably correctly described as race riots in the 1980s, again in 2001. But I think set against that, if you go to, I don't know, somewhere like northwest London, you go to Harrow, you go to Solihull, places where you have often, middle-class people from minority backgrounds who are lawyers and accountants living fully integrated into British society, that is a kind of living disproof of Powell's pessimism.
Enoch sincerely believed that there was going to be a great social upheaval in this country if we did not control immigration. That was what motivated him to make the speech. He wanted everybody in this country to live happily together, and that includes immigrants.
I did know Enoch Powell, not very well, but a bit in his later years, and I got the very clear impression that he wasn't quite as brilliant as everybody said. He was actually a stupid person's idea of an intelligent person. He was persuading his audience that here was a very learned man indeed, and a master of logic and of classical studies, who had reached, by his own highly intelligent means, exactly the same conclusions as they had.
If someone was to ask me the question, Enoch said we would never be integrated. Are we now? No, we're not. We're not truly integrated. But there are many reasons for that. For the abuses that my mother and her friends and my uncles had to suffer in the 70s when they first immigrated to this country, you can't just forget that. If immigration to this country had taken place and it was a much more tolerable, open, loving environment for these people to come into, maybe integration might have been much better seated. Maybe we wouldn't see an area in Birmingham that might be 85% Asian. But I cannot blame these people for becoming insular when they face this oppression. So though Enoch's kind of predicting this what would happen, I mean, it's not anything we should commend him over.
Enoch Powell was at once the most loved and the most hated man in Britain.
Storm of political passion swept Britain after Enoch Powell's emotional April speech. He claimed to be surprised by the reaction.
There's 2,026 signatures there to say that Mr. Enoch's right. That we have the right to say who we like and who we don't like.
Enoch Powell has resurrected the virus of racialism, just as Enoch Powell's crime.
I told Mr. Powell that he could not remain a member of the Shadow Cabinet because of the inflammatory nature of his speech at Birmingham.
If Mr. Powell had made his speech at any other time, would you still have sacked him?
Yes, because it was, as I said, an inflammatory speech, causing, I believe, grave damage to race relations.
It took just over 24 hours for Enoch Powell to be sacked by his leader, Edward Heath. Steelworkers went on a half-day strike the following Tuesday. 1,000 dockers and the meat porters of Smithfield Market held protests and demanded his reinstatement. When Parliament debated the Race Relations Bill on the Thursday, Powell stayed silent. He passed through the lobby voting against the bill, but the Labour government had its way, and the Race Relations Bill eventually gained royal assent on the 25th of October, 1968. I'm from Tooting in South London, a hugely diverse community in which British Asians of all varieties have peacefully commingled with their white counterparts. My parents came over from India in 1986, when Margaret Thatcher, a student of Powell, was at the height of her powers. Listening back to Powell, the echoes of our own politics seem loud. But it's impossible not to feel the intemperance of his language set back the very cause that he was espousing. Britain has, for the most part peacefully, accepted many more new arrivals than Powell thought it could. Occasional unrest has not come close to rivers of blood, and the majority of white British people do not believe that black man has the whip hand over them. Moreover, civility of tone matters in public life, and by eschewing it in his speech, Powell made it harder for native British folk to talk about their fears. Some members of Britain's ethnic minority communities did suffer harassment as a result of what he said. In my view, by these measures, a growth in self-censorship and abuse towards minorities, the speech was a failure. In the wake of the speech, and for the rest of his life, Powell denied he was a racist in our modern sense of the word, believing in the superiority of one group to another. He cast himself as a racialist, someone who recognized immutable human differences and felt excessive mixing of peoples would cause unrest. This lets him off too lightly. Some forgive his repeated references to Negroes and aliens as common parlance for the time. That is generous. And in his references to wide-grinning pickaninnies, the whip hand, and his refusal to countenance any advantages to immigration, Powell crosses a line into ugly prejudice. It is impudent to ask whether the speech was racialist or racist. Make no mistake, it was both.